Hey, what's going on, y'all? So I have before me a fake indictment for TIandTiny. And let me explain how this thing came to be. So I was actually looking at Tyrone Blackburn's letter, and I was looking at some of the allegations in that letter, and I realized that TIandTiny may never actually be indicted. Now, the reason I actually say this is because when you look at some of the allegations in the letter, you'll see that some of them are some very serious allegations. As you read that letter, you'll see that as the story is told, you would come to believe that there is going to be some records of some of the incidents that happen in the story if that story is actually true. So, if the story is true, and if there's factual records or factual information that can be pulled up, you would ask yourself, why is it that TIandTiny has not been indicted by now? And the reason I believe they haven't been indicted is because some of these stories may not be true, or some of the facts may be off. And the reason I say this is because if the facts were true and if the story was true, and if there were information or records, right, the authorities wouldn't hesitate to indict because they have enough information. They have the alleged victims, they have the alleged victims' testimony, and then in some situations, you have the allegation that one of the young ladies went to the hospital, and there would be records of that. So, because there is no indictment now, and again, if you look at that letter is at least 1 years old. And just in case you don't have access to the letter, or you've never seen the letter, if you've never heard anyone read it, I'm going to place a link above where I actually go through the allegations in that letter. But the gist of it is this: it's 2021. I believe that letter was written in 2020, and there's been no arrests. And if the information in the letter is true, and if there are records, then the information in the allegations alone is enough to compel the authorities to indict TIandTiny. And you have the alleged victims, you have their allegations, and you have the records. There's no reason for the authorities not to indict. So I'm believing that it's never going to happen, and I'm believing that the a lot of information in the letter is probably going to be nonsense. And again, with my channel, I try to be balanced and I try not to bash victims. So please don't take that as victim bashing. I'm just trying to figure out why there's no indictment by now. I think someone said that maybe the authorities started an investigation. However, if you look at the letter, you'll see that the information in the letter is enough to convict TIandTiny, and no investigation is needed. So the indictment is never going to happen. So for educational purposes, I ended up reading the letter over and over, and I asked myself, what would an indictment look like for TIandTiny? And that's how I actually came up with this fake indictment for TIandTiny. Now, again, this indictment is not real. What I've done is that I've taken some of the information in the letter from Blackburn, and I combined it with some of the information that was provided in R. Kelly's letter. And the result is a federal charge or federal indictment. And essentially, it's a RICO charge, right? It's a RICO charge. It starts off using some of the elements from the R. Kelly indictment and using some of the elements from Blackburn's letter, and I combine them as one. And the reason I decided to do that is because when you look at Blackburn's letter and you look at R. Kelly's indictment, you see that some of the elements are essentially similar. They're very similar. And I don't know if maybe Blackburn was looking out on the internet, and I'm not saying he did, right? I'm not alleging that he did, but I'm just trying to come up with a theory on how a theory on the reasons why the R. Kelly indictment and Blackburn's letter and several other cases all look similar, right? I'm coming up with a theory. If you have a better theory, you let me know. So to me, it seems like Blackburn drafted. He could have, right? I'm not alleging he did, but it seemed to me like Blackburn or someone could have drafted this letter using some of the other popular indictments as a template, right? So everyone knows that the Me Too movement has been calls for indicting lots of people. And I'm thinking that maybe there's a possibility that maybe Blackburn took elements from all these different scenarios, right? So without further ado, let's just go ahead and get into this fake indictment. Again, I can't stress enough that this indictment is fake. It's not real. It's just something I made up. And let's just go ahead and get into it. And again, this is for education and entertainment purposes only, right? Indictment goes on and it says United States District Court, Northern District of Georgia. And this indictment is for the United States of America against Clifford Joseph Harris Jr., also known as T.I., Tip, and Tamika Diane Cottle, also known as Tiny. And this fictitious indictment pretends that there was a grand jury. There was no grand jury. I'm just making this up. And the grand jury is actually indicting T.I. and Tiny on the following violations. Title 18 U.S. Code Section 1961-4, Title 21 U.S. Code Section 841A1, Title 10 U.S. Code 920, Title 18 U.S. Code Section 875. And it goes on, and it reads this way. Introduction at all times relevant to this indictment unless otherwise indicated. The enterprise, the defendants Clifford Joseph Harris Jr., T.I., and Tamika Diane Cottle, Tiny, collectively TNT, and individuals who serve as drivers, personal assistants, security guards, and others associated, compromise, and enterprise. The enterprise within the meaning of Title 18 U.S. Code Section 1961-4, that is, the enterprise constituted a group of individuals associated in fact that was engaged in and activities which affected interstate and foreign commerce. The enterprise constituted an ongoing organization whose members functioned as a continuing unit for a common purpose of achieving objectives of the enterprise. The purpose of the enterprise were to promote TNT's music and TNT brand, to recruit women and girls to engage in illegal sexual activity with TNT by promoting TNT and the TNT brand. The members of the enterprise expected to receive financial opportunities, nice typo here, and personal benefits, including increased power and status with the enterprise. In connection with the enterprise, TNT and others, in connection with the enterprise, TNT and other members of the enterprise traveled throughout the United States and abroad to perform at concerts to promote TNT brand and to recruit women and girls to engage in illegal sexual activity with TNT. When TNT attended and performed at concerts and other events, TNT and other members of the enterprise on TNT's behalf invited women and girls backstage and to other events following TNT's live performance. Count 1, distribution of controlled substance, rape, sexual assault of Jane Doe 1. This indictment alleges that TNT gave Jane Doe 1 a controlled substance in violation of Title 21 U.S. Code Section 841A1 with the intent to rape and sexually assault Jane Doe 1 in violation of Title 10 U.S. Code Section 920. In 2005, Jane Doe 1 went to a club at comedian Little Duval's invitation. TNT were sitting in the VIP section. Tiny pointed out to them and invited them in. Tiny was doing all the talking, and T.I. was sitting off to the side. Tiny sat next to Jane Doe 1 and offered her a sip of Patron, which Tiny was in the process of drinking. She sipped the drink and passed it to her friend to try. T.I. then announced that they were leaving and going to another location. Jane Doe 1 and two other girls rode with him. T.I.'s accomplice took Jane Doe's one friend with him. They went back to his hotel room where one of the girls attempted to slip T.I. her phone number. Tiny saw and became upset. T.I. asked her to leave, and since she was with the driver for the third girl, she left with her. Tiny then suggested that Jane Doe 1, T.I., and herself freshen up before the other guests arrived. They went into the shower where Tiny washed T.I. and Jane Doe 1. When Jane Doe 1 left the restroom, she felt lightheaded and dizzy. This was an uncommon occurrence for her since she only had one drink on her own, plus the drink Tiny gave her. She sat on the bed, and Tiny laid behind her in a crab position and began rubbing her buttocks on Jane Doe's one back, giving her a back butt massage. At that point, ooh, at that point, Jane Doe 1 started feeling sick and began throwing up. T.I. came over and attempted to put his foot into her private parts. Jane Doe 1 told him no, and the next thing she remembers was waking up naked on the couch with a towel thrown over her with a very sore private part. T.I.'s security banged on the door and told her she had to leave and arranged for her to be dropped off at the gas station in LA where she met her friend. Count 2. Attempt to distribute a controlled substance, making unlawful threats, sexual assault to Jane Doe 2. This indictment alleges that TIandTiny attempted to distribute a controlled substance, made several threats, and sexually assaulted Jane Doe 2 in violation of Title 21 U.S. Code 841-81, Title 18 U.S. Code 875, Title 10 U.S. Code Section 920. In 2006, Tiny invited Jane Doe 2 to attend a party at the W Hotel in New York City. They went to the party and went back to their hotel with a group of women. Jane Doe 2 did not drink or do drugs. Tiny and T.I. sandwiched her on the couch and attempted to convince her to take pills and have sex with them. She told them she was on her period and left. Jane Doe 2 and Tiny stayed in touch, and Jane Doe 2 moved to Atlanta in 2007. Tiny invited Jane Doe 2 to the studio in January 2007 and passed her off to her security, Cedric Zellis, also known as Alpha Mega. Jane Doe 2 rejected his advances, and he grabbed her phone, put his number in, called himself, and began stalking her nonstop for months. She ignored him until she saw him again for 2 months later. At the second encounter, Alpha Omega grabbed her up, put a gun to her head, and then blindfolded her, put her in his car, and drove 20 to 50 minutes into Georgia. He raped her 3 times within a 24-hour window, drove her back to the studio the following day, and gun whipped her, threatened to kill her if she spoke. Shortly after, she received a call from T.I. threatening her to never come near his studio again. Count 3, distribution of a controlled substance to Jane Doe number 3. This indictment alleges that TIandTiny distributed a controlled substance in violation of Title 21 U.S. Code Section 841-A1. In 2005, T.I. forced Jane Doe 3 to take multiple ecstasy pills. On one occasion, T.I. stood over her and Tiny stood close by, and T.I. forced her to open her mouth and swallow 8 ecstasy pills. As a result of being in TIandTiny's circle, Jane Doe 3 developed a drug addiction and bipolar disorder. Jane Doe 3 has medical records to show the extent of her addiction. Count 4, distribution of a controlled substance to Jane Doe 4. This indictment alleges that TIandTiny distributed a controlled substance in violation of Title 21 U.S. Code Section 841A1. An intern of Grand Hustle Studios invited Jane Doe 4 to visit the studio. They went to Chipotle before visiting the studio. She went inside and sat in one of the rooms. She placed her bags down, as well as her food. She went outside with the intern to the tour grounds. She turned 30 minutes later and ate her food. She immediately felt dizzy and lightheaded. The intern left her in the lobby and went back to the studio. When she returned, she informed him that she had to leave. The security guards were laughing, and she ran outside. She ran into the street and called her roommates to pick her up. They came, and she began hallucinating in the car. She called her mom, who was a psychiatrist, and demanded her to return home to Maryland. Her mom told her that she believed she was slipped a date rape drug. She went to a detox clinic where she sobered up. Count 5, distribution of a controlled substance, Jane Doe 5. In 2006, Jane Doe 5 was a 17-year-old senior in Tri-City High School. Jane Doe 5 began interning for TNT at the Atlanta studio. On a tour bus on their way back to Georgia, Tiny offered Jane Doe 5 and another high school intern a drink. This was the first time she ever drank. Jane Doe 5 began feeling sick, and Tiny told Jane Doe 5 she could not drink on an empty stomach. She then handed her 2 pills and told Jane Doe 5 to swallow them. It would make her feel better. Jane Doe 5 thought the pills were Tylenol, but she started feeling hot and sweaty within minutes of swallowing them. Jane Doe number 5 began hallucinating and felt like she was floating. Tiny and everyone in the bus started laughing at Jane Doe 5, and Tiny told Jane Doe 5 to come to the back of the bus where the bedroom was located. She told Jane Doe 5 to undress so she could cool off. Jane Doe 5 took her top off but began throwing up. At the time, T.I. came to the back and sat next to Jane Doe 5. He complimented Jane Doe 5 on her completion and told her she was very pretty. Tiny then told her to keep drinking because that was the only way to sober up. Jane Doe 5 passed out and wakes up the following morning naked on the bed with the other school intern and another young girl. Jane Doe 5 was bleeding from a private part. She felt like she was on her menstrual cycle, but then realized that her virginity was taken. She also felt discomfort in her rear end. When they arrived in Atlanta, Clay, an employee of TNT, asked Jane Doe 5 how she was getting home. She said her mom and Clay told her no and offered to drop her home. Tiny called him on his phone and told him to make sure that he stops off at a pharmacy to get Jane Doe 5 a morning after pill. He then made her swallow the pill and warned her that she needs to learn to keep her mouth shut if she wants to make it in the music business. He told her that if she did not, that bad things could happen to her and her family. That night, Sunday, Jane Doe 5 slept and defecated on herself because she lost all control of her bowels. Jane Doe 5 went to school where she defecated on herself again. Her aunt came and took her to the hospital where Jane Doe 5 learned that she was defecating on herself due to trauma caused to her anal cavity due to intense anal penetration. So that is essentially it for this fake indictment. Again, this is a fake indictment. Nothing in this indictment is real. Again, what I've done is that I took Tyrone Blackburn's letter and I combined it with some of the indictments for R. Kelly. And the reason I did that is because what I noticed, as I said before, some of the allegations in the indictment appear to be similar to several allegations that are out there for other celebrities. So for education and for educational and for entertainment purposes, I decided to combine them just to see what it would look like. Now, you guys let me know. Do you think that there's a chance that TIandTiny could receive a similar indictment for some of the allegations that has been made against him? Do you think that TIandTiny will never be indicted? So that's it for this video. Let me know what you think. Leave your questions or comments below. Please like, share, and subscribe.